Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual public program, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, with Ned Blackhawk in conversation with Robert Warrior. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources AAS has been collecting since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world to use the collections, both physical and digital, we host programs like today's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. We thank you for joining us this afternoon, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. My colleague, Nan Wolverton, will be sharing a few notes on how to comment and ask questions in the Zoom Q&A. She'll also post links and relevant information in the chat throughout the program. This program, which is part of our series, Insights from Indigenous Studies, is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page following the live stream. Now, I'm delighted to introduce this afternoon's two speakers. Both are elected members of the American Antiquarian Society. Ned Blackhawk is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, an enrolled member of the Tamok tribe of Western Shoshone Indians of Nevada. He's the author and co-editor of 4 books: Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, which appeared in 2006, won a half-dozen professional prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians. His latest book, and the subject of today's conversation, is The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction just this past November. It's simply an extraordinary synthesis of U.S. history over 500 years, a new look at histories we didn't know, or perhaps thought we knew, but really didn't. Robert Warrior is the Hall Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of Kansas, and a member citizen of the Osage Nation. He's the author of Tribal Secrets, Recovering American Indian Intellectual Traditions, and The People and the Word, Reading Native Nonfiction. He's also the co-author of 3 books, Like a Hurricane, The Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, American Indian Literary Nationalism, and Reasoning Together, the Native Critics Collective. We're honored to have Ned Blackhawk and Robert Warrior with us today to talk about the rediscovery of America. I'll turn it over to them now and return in about 40 minutes to present questions from our audience. And as a reminder, you and our audience can post questions in the Q&A at any time during the program. Over to you, Robert Warrior and Ned Blackhawk.
Thanks so much, Scott. Really appreciate the introduction, and really thrilled to be here with Ned, who I've known for many, many years, and who has accomplished a bunch. I was just thinking as Scott was doing the introduction, Ned, that along with the big historical prizes you won, you also won the Laura Romero Prize from the American Studies Association, which is very specifically an award that which is looking for the best book, best first book that takes on issues of race, sexuality, gender in the American experience. And to think that Violence Over the Land won, the prizes were on that range is really remarkable, and I think the book really stands up. But this one's a really big prize, the National Book Award, and I haven't had a chance to, other than by email, to say, congratulations, and so a wonderful achievement. So I thought I would start by asking you a question that I actually wanted to tell a story about something that you might not remember, but I do, just to get us going. And then I've got a bunch of questions, as you've seen. So I don't know if you remember that we were in the lobby of a hotel in Philadelphia for an American Studies meeting when you were picking up that Laura Romero Award, and you asked me as we were talking about books, and about books in Native studies. He said, Robert, how is it that we can get more attention to books in our field? And I think at the time I was thinking, well, Ned, you should win an association-wide prize. That'll get people noticing your book. I've never won one of those. So, that was one thing. But then I have a really great answer now. You should win a National Book Award, and that'll probably really help you get, the word out about your work. So, anyway, just if you want to start off by saying something, I want to give you a chance before I launch into my questions.
Yeah, it's a real honor to be here, and particularly be with you. Some of our participants online may not know the extraordinary labors that we all know in the field that you've helped build. And so we are in an interesting moment generationally where, looking back retrospectively on the last generation or so, there has been this kind of profound emergence of Native American and Indigenous studies as a scholarly field. Our primary association was established, largely or partially under your leadership. You are the inaugural first president of our association. And that happened relatively shortly after that Philadelphia meeting that you're referencing, when it felt like, there really wasn't sufficient recognition of this field. So we've come a long way. I still think we have a long ways to go. And this may lead into our conversation about the book itself. The book, is dependent upon this kind of generation of insights. And so I've really titled it The Rediscovery of America, not as a kind of imperative of my own making, but as a recognition of the work that so many others have done to rediscover critical aspects of American history and culture. And so I'm not quite sure whether we should be, pessimistic about the lack of incorporation in certain ways, or the really optimistic about the kind of dissemination that has occurred. But I think it's a really kind of remarkable time, as someone like Brenda Child has been recently remarking. It's a really remarkable time to be doing Indigenous intellectual work of various kinds.
I think it's a great point, and one I think that I had to remind myself as I was reading the book, that I wasn't reading a book that was merely saying, here's how we do Native American history. Here's a way to redo it. It is a really ambitious project, an audacious one in certain ways, of saying we really need to do Native American history. To do Indigenous history means we have to do history, and then we have to redo American history. We have to reframe it. We have to remake it. We have to unmake it first, and then remake it in your words. And I guess my first question has to do with, how did you imagine and realize that you could take on this particular kind of big synthetic project?
I'm not quite sure where the precise origins of this project reside. But I think there was just a series of kind of aha moments over the last 15 or 20 years of my academic career, where it just profoundly occurred to me that very few people were aware of, or likely would ever become aware of, certain things. And those kind of aha anecdotal, kind of almost like epiphenomenal, or those kind of singular events kind of crystallize into this larger form, as I started realizing, as we both know, the lack of relative, when I started realizing that there still remains a tremendous lack of infrastructure within both Native American history and Indigenous studies more broadly. There really isn't even a good common textbook for course adoption in Native American history. Several co-authored books kind of fall into the more conventional kind of textbook kind of form, which sometimes, rather than asking or posing questions, they try to answer them. And ironically, you may not know that the best-selling, or the kind of most serially re-edited or republished work for class adoption is a book of documentary collections by documentary collection by Colin Calloway. So even the best textbooks are they're also often very prohibitively expensive. So there wasn't there isn't essentially as much infrastructure in the field as it really merits. And so, as you probably know, my advisor wrote a kind of Richard White wrote a kind of best-selling Western history textbook. There are these like common textbooks in fields like U.S. environmental history or the history of the Spanish borderlands. Early American history has several kind of competing interpretive overviews, but Native American history has kind of lagged behind in that regard, in part because the subject is so extraordinarily vast, both temporally, spatially, ethnographically, kind of politically. It is kind of, as you said, maybe an audacious undertaking. And I, by no means, think of it as comprehensive. But I feel it does kind of provide a kind of uniform approach that takes 12 conventional paradigms or subfields of U.S. history, like British North America or the Civil War era, the Cold War era. It takes those types of paradigms and shows how Indigenous history in many ways is central to all of them and helps us understand or remake American history for those eras. And it draws upon these kind of vast profusion of scholarship that I started out discussing. So that's where the kind of seeds are. There are a couple moments, and I think one of your questions might lead us there, where it particularly occurred to me that American historians, we seem to be learning more and more about less and less at times. And we kind of lost sense of the kind of causations of some singular moments that I really felt we needed to return to. And so chapters 3, 4, and 5, and 6 of the book are really all about the early British, early Northeastern, kind of Franco-British indigenous world, out of which the United States is both born and then constituted.
So it seems like to me there's two parts to that moment of saying, is this possible? One is, does the historiography support the project, right? Because you can't say it's a new way of doing history and then only quote from books that are 50, 75, 100 years old, right? So you've got to say, is that new generation of scholarship sufficient to support this sort of synthesis? And then you have to say, can I be the one that pulls it all together, right? So that seems like that's maybe a lonely moment. Who did you first utter, hey, I think I'm going to do this thing, right? How did you do that? Who did you say that to?
Well, the first point is, yes, the historiography supports it. So I never felt alone in that regard, as you often talk about or have talked about being in the archive with the voices and works, that confirm your instincts. So at no point did I ever feel as if there wouldn't be sufficient empirical or kind of secondary studies to ground these claims. And one of the great delights of this was learning a lot about those fields, which I didn't know sometimes that much about beforehand. The second question was how, to be the one who tackles these undertakings. It's a little bit of a particular characteristic of my own training and background is that I was drawn to Indigenous history at a very young age, academically and professionally. We called it American Indian history back then. And I wasn't really sufficiently trained in it for a couple of years of my career because it didn't have, like I was referencing, some of the kind of requisite historiographical articles or monographs, or it wasn't really taught much. And so I had to kind of self-train myself while doing this other thing called U.S. history. And so this other thing called U.S. history, I've been doing as long as I've been doing Native American history. And this other thing called U.S. history has always had, really incredible journals and conferences and associations and all the things that academics kind of live and breathe on, or live and kind of thrive on. And so I was dissatisfied with some of my initial exposures to Indigenous history, which made it seem like another kind of dimension of the American multicultural experience. It was like one of the ethnic studies fields, or it was a social history to be added at certain times. And as you know, Van Deloria kind of made that kind of critique a long time ago about the cameo appearance that Indians would make in U.S. history. And while some scholars have done sufficient jobs bringing Indians periodically into the subject matter, and never felt really full-throated or kind of sufficient, as sufficient of a commitment as would be needed. And so this kind of other thing called U.S. history, I decided to kind of bring And I have, even in my first book, tried to do or been forced to do more of kind of the temporally or regionally oriented studies. And so one of the kind of interesting things about Native American history over the last 25 years is that the field of early American history has been the kind of largest terrain of engagement, and kind of monumental works have kind of helped reorient that field away from a kind of a Eurocentric or Anglocentric paradigm. Big regional studies by people like that, well, like Kathleen Duvall or Michael Witkin, James Brooks, Claudio Sant, myself, Gene O'Brien, Josh Reed, more recently about the Northwest, have all done these big regional histories that cover vast periods and times, relatively speaking. And so they're not really social history projects in the same ways that the field may have been 30 years ago or 35 years ago. They are really robust, empirical, and kind of argumentative works that Liz Ellis has this brilliant new book on Louisiana that's similarly fashioned. So there's a lot of people doing what we call Indians and Empires. And not by coincidence, the first part of the book is called Indians and Empires. So there was a kind of a group of people. So I left behind, my kind of initial attempts at urban Indian kind of social community formations, and entered into, partly because of my own personal and tribal interests, a kind of Great Basin regional history. And so that kind of training and exposure to literatures and arguments about kind of longue durée type subject matters convinced me, as I did in my first book, to try to take on certain things. So just by one quick anecdote, in my first book, Violence Over the Land, it was a 4-chapter dissertation that became like a 7 or 8 chapter book. And at one point, I decided I had to read the journals of Lewis and Clark. And there are no kind of, more extensively studied set of Western explorers whose journals are also quite expensive. But I did it. I made sense of like a 2 or 3 week period of their journal through that kind of engagement, which isn't actually that difficult, but it's more the kind of mental and kind of psychological barrier to kind of crack that I, in my own relative space and time, have the capability to say something new about something so canonical. And so once you start doing that once or twice or a few times, you kind of get used to it. And so in this book, I, as confront, Jefferson, Washington, the Spanish explorers, the Franco colonists of New France. It becomes a little more kind of common practice.
So, I mean, I'm gonna go to. I want to go to some of that about Jefferson, and then go back to a couple of other questions. So, I mean, it seems like there are so many of these topics that you take up that are seemingly like Teflon. And it seems like to me that I've written about Jefferson fairly recently, and it just seemed like to me, no matter what kind of evidence you put in front of people, that there's always this sort of grudging admiration for Jefferson that comes out at the end, which, I mean, I think that he's a genius, and I think that there's these amazing things that are there in the story as an amazing, person in history. But that sort of great man sort of thing, that the great man gets to do whatever the heck he wants to whoever he wants and get away with it, always surprised me just trying to write about Jefferson in an article. And it seems like you take on a bunch of these things like that, these sort of iconic figures. One of them is the Eastern Seaboard. Everything has to happen around not just the Eastern Seaboard, right? But Massachusetts and Virginia. Which one do you want to start with? And then how are you going to bring them together, right? And so, you start your story on the Eastern Seaboard at Block Island and the massacre at Block Island, right? So it's a different sort of thing in Rhode Island. You do this with the basic idea of environmental history, which has become such an important and critical thing that we do. And go to Richard White, to Bill Cronin, and Donald Worcester and others that you make the point. You say, well, maybe epidemiology is really important, and the way that plants are, and the way that farms go, and fencing, and all these things are really important. but maybe the social aspects of the story are also really important, right? And so you're taking on these various things that are tough, I think, to constantly figure out, how am I going to write against this? Or if I'm not writing against it, I'm trying to do something else other than that, right? And I'm wondering about what kind of discipline it takes to say, I'm going to write about something called the interior, instead of just assuming that, well, the power centers are all in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., and in Virginia, Philadelphia, New York, and say, is that really true? Right? Have we actually found out that that's maybe not true? Maybe what's actually driving this story is actually in the Ohio River Valley, right? In the interior that becomes the Old Northwest, that then becomes, that then crosses the Mississippi. So what was the mix of fun and the mix of sort of discipline, where you have to remind yourself, I'm not writing that story, I'm writing this story? What was that like?
It was fun in certain ways because there is a certain excitement around taking ideas, bringing them together, and fashioning perhaps new ones, or at least distilling them, other people's ideas, into new paradigms. So for me, one of those kind of anecdotal moments of aha-ness was, it wasn't just reading the beginning of a book by a Colorado historian by the name of Fred Anderson, who wrote a book called Crucible of War, which is about 900 pages, and it's all about the 7 Years' War. One of the aha moments wasn't just that it opened with Washington's battle from 1754, when he is essentially outmaneuvered and exhausted and nearly destroyed at a plain near the Virginia-Pennsylvania border, where he establishes a fort called Fort Necessity and surrenders on July 4th, ironically, of 1754, to a combined French and Indigenous force. It wasn't just that was his first battle, that it opens this monumental study, that it's the first theater in a larger theater. But this guy Anderson, who I never really met, but I've thought of in many, because the book came out like 2003. It was one of those books where I thought, okay, very few people are really going to understand what he's not just saying, but what he's drawing upon, because that book is really a synthesis of certain pre-existing literatures, which involve a lot of that Ohio River interior history, which starts not in the 1750s, not in even the 1700s, but really, centuries and a half or so before the Revolution. And so it really starts in many ways with, one could say even the Confederation of the Iroquois is one of the kind of central political moments of early American history that begins, centuries before Europeans even encounter North America, either in the 1200s or 1300s or whenever archaeologists confirm its exact origins. That Confederacy's relationships with the French and their indigenous allies across eastern Canada, along the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes, is at the heart of chapter 3 of this book. So I always knew that was going to be an anchor or a bookend to make larger claims about how that evolution sets in motion the things that Anderson and many others have already explained. You probably know some of the kind of Iroquois debates about the extent to which the Iroquois may or may not have kind of factored into the constitutionalization of the Federalist system.
Right.
But there, that's one of the kind of curious, unanswered questions of early American history that I don't even take on, because it's not really fully resolved.
Yeah.
And so we all
How dare
know,
you?
Yeah, how dare exactly. I know but there are debates. There are kind of familiar paths into this world. We could take Washington, we could take Franklin. Jefferson, ironically, and I write about this, spent most of the first years of the independence of the United States in France. And so he wasn't there when, when many of the kind of seminal moments of early American Indian diplomacy and history were being formed. He's much more concerned about the Haitian Revolution, as I write about in chapter 7. He does obviously come to some miracle resolution around Louisiana. He's not happy about that initial challenge, because the Federalist system wasn't meant to incorporate citizens in these ways, not just Indians, but also other Catholic or non-Anglophone populations. It's a huge debate, and he really resents the power of the Federalists in the 1790s. So I'm not saying anything that other people haven't said about him, largely, but very few people see him as sufficiently kind of grounded in a kind of, I don't want to say illogical, but kind of uninformed interior policy. And so one of the ironies for me in writing some of those chapters was this realization that Washington's vision of a federalist society with demarcated boundaries and diplomatic relationships with interior tribes and a kind of urgent need for federalist power, either through infrastructure or military affairs, in many ways was a lot more kind of pluralistic legally than Jeffersonian ideas of American democracy, which we kind of conflate with de Tocqueville and other kind of romanticist ideas about the kind of purity of the American yeoman farmer and the kind of natural, yeah. So there is a lot of kind of Enlightenment thinking that needs to be kind of provincialized a bit to really enter into the history of this period. And I'm still shocked and trying to do a little work on my own right now about the Declaration's merciless Indian savages, which is the 27th grievance, I think, or 20, it's either, I think it's the 27th or 22nd grievance in the Declaration itself. I'm still relatively new into this literature, but very few people have really understood that those terms, savages and frontier communities that are in that last grievance, hail from this interior world. And so it's like it really brings that subject right to the center of the revolutionary period, and also exposes, as the book kind of it begins with, this kind of profound erasure or marginalization that still resonates across American scholarly institutions and literatures. And I do name a few historians for maintaining that kind of form of calcified knowledge in the early chapter or in the introduction. I could talk much more about it, but it's still very prevalent, the extent to which Indigenous history is excised, even from these discussions around the Louisiana Purchase, the Constitution, and the Revolution, which were all in certain ways about Indian affairs.
So, I mean, that brings me back to this question that I have about Indigenous studies, Native American studies, Indigenous studies. It seems like to me that the practice of history gives anyone license to say, this really hasn't worked out very well for us in understanding Indigenous history. What's going on over here? And I think that your introduction really shows your knowledge of and insights from what's happened in Native American studies in the past 50 years, but especially the past 25 years. And I wonder, I mean, one of the questions I really had was, as I read the introduction especially, what does this say about history? I mean, is history open to this sort of looking around and finding ideas from other places? I know historians are always open to those things, but will they be taken seriously? Because it's not just that you go and find some things from sociology or quantitative historical sociology, but you're going off into Indigenous feminisms and reading in really theoretical works that I think most historians would have trouble understanding what the point is, right? Not because they're not smart, but because it's such a different way of thinking. And so how do you see that? I mean, I think history is so important to what we do in Native studies, and having be able to historicize any particular moment, especially around ideas that you're working with around legality, policy, governmentality, that I just wonder, is this opening the door to that, or am I being too optimistic about the profession of history and what will happen in the future?
The history profession is kind of like it may seem to have a kind of calm surface at times, but there's a lot of undercurrents often of filtering or intermixing in ways that aren't always evident. And the rise of Indigenous studies has paralleled or kind of helped drive the rise of Indigenous history, or vice versa. I'm not, it's, and I think we don't even sufficiently understand ourselves, the extent to which we are living in a kind of radically kind of changed intellectual universe in certain ways. And, just because in that meeting, for example, in Philadelphia, you and I were at was in 07, I believe, fall of 07. There were scholars who did U.S. empire at the time, who were, former presidents, as you would know, who studied these subjects without talking about Indigenous peoples. And so even the study of U.S. empire at the time, 20 years ago, wasn't sufficiently congruent with where we are now, or where we became very quickly after the rise of things like settler colonial studies, or these kind of theoretical models that you're referencing. And so even in a relatively short scholarly period of 15 or 20 years, and I think of like Mark Rifkin's winning of the John Hope Franklin Prize from the American Studies Association, Margaret Jacobs winning the Bancroft Prize for her work on Aboriginal and U.S. Indian kind of boarding school histories and child welfare issues. There were kind of these moments in the early 2000s and shortly thereafter where the field started kind of, the undercurrents started kind of filtering. So history has become a wonderfully rich terrain, but it's still kind of segmented by these siloed paradigms or periodizations or emphases. And so early American history has kind of created some spaces. The early history of the early republic hasn't. The larger national associations like the OAH or the AHA still don't have Native American article or journal or book prizes. You may not know that this Canadian Historical Association has had each of those for roughly a decade, if not more. And so that's just and not only that, but like the prizes in Canadian history have been going to Aboriginal history or First Nations history recurringly. So it's somewhat exceptional, maybe not as much as it used to be, but maybe once every 5 or 10 years, a Native American history title is either a finalist or a winner for the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize, as I was. But in Canada, that's not the case. So we have to kind of think through American history's kind of structures of formation in order to reorient them. And I think one of the interesting ways of doing that is to kind of lay out how central not only Indigenous history has been for the formation of American history more broadly, but how even the kind of intellectual paradigms of early America or the West or the kind of distinctive American individualisms, many of the paradigms we associate with Americanness itself have some kind of Indigenous roots that haven't been often fully recognized.
So, I mean, one of the things on that seems so clear from Rediscovery of America is that what you're asking or what you're sort of demanding, or what I think the project itself demands, is not that we do more, right? Not that historians do more, not that American history be more and that it opened itself up to more things, but actually that there's not just a rediscovery, but actually an unmaking, as you call it, to say, I need to rethink a lot of these things, to say maybe we haven't, if all of these things about the interior, about Jefferson, about this, about that, are actually we've gotten wrong, then maybe we need to keep thinking more about that, right? I think one of the examples of that was really striking to me. First of all, I got to say about like the whole project. I was thinking, oh yeah, I know a bit of that from this thing I read. John Joseph Matthews, in his big, massive tribal history on the Osages, makes this claim: the Osages were impacting European policy, right? What the Europeans could and couldn't do. They were only 5,000 people here in the Trans-Mississippi West, but they were making decisions that were thwarting the ambitions of the French and of the English. And, it sounds kind of crazy when oh, come on, the Osages couldn't have been doing that. But I think he's right, but it just doesn't seem that possible until you read case after case after case, right? Of these sorts of things, and they add up. And I think that's one of the benefits of the sort of synthesis that you've done. One of the areas in that seems a challenge that's still ahead is around the era of the Civil War, and even understanding that the Civil War, in fact, was taking place all the way out to California, right? I think that you do this really wonderful job of showing the extent to which all of these isolated cases, Pea Ridge, and I was thinking about the split among the Osages between the North and the South, the Cherokees, and you get all the way out to California, Denver. You make a big point about Denver and its role in the Civil War. And I think it really calls for a rethinking of what the Civil War is. Not to say, hey, this was really an indigenous thing, right? I mean, it's clearly slavery is a really big part of this, and it's the fundamental bedrock of the conflict. But until you widen out your focus and what you're talking about, and understanding, well, you say this ends up being a way that the U.S. harnesses power, right? It's a big point that you make. What does that mean for doing history that does not just American history writ large? How does that say, very specifically, I guess I'm interested in the relationship between histories of indigeneity and Blackness?
Yeah, there are two kind of important recognitions that I'm really happy that you brought me to or reminded me of. The first of which is more congruent in the kind of antebellum or pre-Civil War era, which is this kind of very strong emphasis on what we might call indigenous agency, which is the kind of clear recognition that we should all understand and make and teach and perhaps research and write about, is that even though we've been taught one thing, there are in fact multiple truths to the claim that indigenous peoples also made American history. And it may not seem evident that 5,000 Osage Indians helped redirect the course of American history, but if you were to distill it and examine it and look at those kind of delegations and the kind of relationships with the French and the Spanish and later the American, and I don't know that much about the Osage Treaty of 1808, other than the kind of massive land dispossession that I think you've written about. But the history of that region prior to that treaty negotiation is, in certain ways, underwritten, but revealing of this kind of larger theme in this book and in the literature more broadly. And so the literature of the field shows very conclusively, not that at every turn, but at significant moments, indigenous peoples, power, influence, agency, thought, action were central contributors to the evolution of whatever we might think of as the early West or the early South, or the even the crisis of the Confederacy, as you're mentioning. And those five treaties with the five civilized tribes, as they're known, were all disbanded, disavowed by the Confederacy, which forced I believe it's 5 Oklahoma Indian nations to sign new treaties with the Confederacy. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government used that moment to force new treaties upon indigenous nations that had previously, reconstituted themselves pretty effectively in many ways in Indian territory. So there's no way you can think of the history of Oklahoma, obviously, or even the western half of the Confederacy outside of these lenses that we've been taught. In the last general the Confederate general to surrender is in fact a Cherokee general, Stan Wadey. So, I mean, to think that the West is not part of the Civil War has done ourselves a tremendous disservice in certain ways. And one of those ways is that we then see the post-Civil War era as one still divided between the North and the South, without realizing the extent to which U.S. power is growing so dramatically over the West, and the ways in which indigenous peoples and others, Mexican Americans, Native Hawaiians, Chinese immigrant communities, other immigrant communities from Latin America and the Pacific, Alaska Natives eventually, how all these other non-white U.S. citizen, future U.S. citizens, but not at the time, become incorporated into a union that is dealing with new challenges and new struggles, but has finally the power and capacity to do things differently. And so there's a big emphasis there about that process. And so that kind of that shift essentially from the Civil War to its aftermath begins a different tale of less kind of central indigenous authority over the national structures of the American government. But nonetheless, the federal government still is dealing with Indian affairs throughout the 19th century, using its administrative powers and its kind of technologies of governance, harnessing resources, and doing a lot of things that it previously was unable to. And so I use in that Civil War chapter 2 anecdotes about Lincoln, for example, that I think are pretty revealing. They both involve him on a train. When he travels to give his famous Cooper Union speech in February of 1860, right before I believe he's named the Republican candidate for president, he has to take 4 different trains that take like 3.5 days.
Yeah.
Because they're different gauges, right? And he has to take like a ferry boat. And that's, right before the war begins. And that's why the chapter starts in Denver, in part because Denver barely existed in 1857, 58 before the gold rush, which is one of these, again, moments that just radically reconfigures geographies and demographies. So there's Lincoln on the train taking days to get to New York. By the time the war is over, his coffin will travel nonstop at 5 miles an hour through basically every major northern town on its way back to Illinois. And so the power of the federal government has become so radically redefined in this short space that we've lost sight of the relatively limited power of the federal government and the union more broadly beforehand, and lost sight of its kind of increased and often naturalized governing capacities thereafter.
And that point that you make about the naturalization of all of that, I think is really crucial to the story you tell, is that's part of the power you gain hegemonically, right? The United States gains is the power to tell the story. And then the story becomes about ideas, about noble ideals and philosophies, as opposed to all of these much different sorts of things. So we're just about out of time. And
Right.
I thought I just want to ask really quickly 2 questions in the question and answer period. I'm now bleeding into it. And before that, I want to say too that we didn't really talk about the relationship of sovereignty and violence, which I think is really crucial to what you're doing. It brings this project together with your earlier project. What I want to ask, a 2-part question. One is really brief description. What are you working on now? Which I know is something you must be doing. And the second part of that is, what are you reading now? What are the books you can recommend to us about the audience we have here after they read Rediscovery of America, which I hope all of them do? Well, what are you reading that you can recommend to us? But what are you working on?
I'm really actually toying around with this revolution problem, and we're about to kind of commemorate the 250th anniversary of the birth of the United States, and I'm still shocked that very few studies of the Revolutionary era and the causes of the revolution locate Indigenous affairs anywhere near their centers. There are a few recent studies. The best scholar working on this subject at the moment is a guy named Robert Parkinson. He teaches at one of the SUNY campuses, and I've never met him, but he's written 2 really interesting books about race and kind of fear and ideologies of hatred, essentially, that are forming from these interior experiences that become kind of central to the revolutionary cause. And he apparently has a new book coming out really soon that I'm looking forward to getting my hands on. His first books were both with Chapel Hill. This new book will be with Norton. So it has the capacity to reach a much larger audience. And I think he's calling it America's Heart of Darkness, which basically will take the themes of my interior chapters and just deepen them and expose them, very likely in a very dramatic new way. Much like Calloway's book on George Washington really brought together 50-year history of Washington's life that, or 40-something year history of his life that few had really ever kind of recognized in full. So I like those types of history books. I'm a little disappointed that I haven't been able to read all the great Indigenous studies works that have come out recently. There've been a series of books in the last like 36 months. Brooke Bauer's book on the Catawba, Liz's new book on Louisiana. I'm trying to think of
Liz
Michael.
Ellis.
Yeah, Liz Ellis, sorry. Michael Wiccan's second book that came out relatively recently. A lot of those books I was unable to get my hands on or use. And so even though the book was published in 2023, it was like submitted in 2022. And like, I finished.
Right.
So certain portions of it were written, long before 2020. And so anything since then, I feel a little remiss that people may not see their work kind of so clearly in it. I'm not sure what I would have done differently, and it may have changed certain things. So I'm kind of excited by those works. I think, that kind of answered both of the questions in some minor form.
Yeah. I think just to comment about what you just said, I think that one of the I always think about, the good old days back in the 90s when you could sort of take on a topic and read everything in Native history or Native studies, maybe not everything, but feel like you've really sort of caught up. And these days it's almost impossible, especially with the turn towards global Indigenous studies. Now you're thinking about what's going on in Maori history, what's going on in Maori literature and Maori political science and Australian theoretical work or education, and then that's just two little places in the world, right? And then you've got all of South America, Central America, Mexico and Canada, which you already brought up, which of course all these things are deeply related and it's exciting, but I don't know that there's anybody that can keep up with everything that's going on. So maybe we'll take that and there's our Scott's there to now help us out with, I think, some questions.
I am back. I've got questions from a number of our viewers. I also wanted to put in a shameless plug first. We did a program with Robert Parkinson about 2 years ago about his book 13 Clocks, which is available on our YouTube channel. Terrific. He's a terrific scholar, and that's a wonderful book. It's a shorter version of his large first book. Jonathan Gosnell writes, "So nice to hear the two of you chat about Indigenous studies. I haven't read the book yet, but I wonder if one might compare the Rediscovery of America to the 1619 Project in some respects, in its premise that Indigenous history and cultures, like African American histories and cultures, are central to our understanding of the contemporary American experience."
Great question, Ned.
Well, I've been kind of floored by the level of recognition that this long-term effort has yielded in a relatively short time. The book came out in April and has done very well academically or professionally in ways that I'm not, I'm having a hard time even kind of processing. So to be compared with such kind of important kind of signature efforts is, very humbling. I don't think it really has the same imperative to locate a particular time and place. The 1619 Project also had a set of like co-authors who were all doing similar but sometimes distinct approaches, some of which I believe were like poetic and memoirish. I think we could use that kind of work for Native American studies, and I'm sure in history more broadly. It'd be nice to see Native American writers more regularly in like the New York Times Magazine. I can't really think of any Native American writers at the moment who have had that opportunity. I'm sure there have been a few. But that kind of recognition, I think, would be helpful and healthy, in part because we are sadly still living in a kind of academic and intellectual world that is often framed around kind of binary racial understandings. And I think Robert's question was trying to get us to think more broadly about multiracial or kind of intersectional kind of racial analyses that will transcend some of those limitations. And I know I've been in conversation with some historians who've been kind of stuck in that framework, and it seems like somewhat of an iron cage that is hard to kind of escape. The more one attempts to do something, the stronger the cage becomes if you're trying to think in new and different ways.
But then I would jump in and say, as you're saying that, it makes me want, I guess, make the point that that binary you're talking about does exist historically, but it gets naturalized as something that is this natural outflow of something. And obviously it came from somewhere, but it becomes more ideologically driven, I think. And so it's not wrong to think, look, this is the binary at work. But I think that the problem becomes if that becomes naturalized into this is the way it is and this is the way it's supposed to have been. What does it hold in place if it's doing that work?
Yeah, we end up getting trapped not only in the kind of history of North South, of free versus slave, of black versus white. We get trapped in kind of narratives of liberation and or teleologies of equality that don't do Indian country any service. And so I've been asked this question once or twice in some of these public forums that I've been involved in. And I use the example of Eric Foner's relatively recent but very influential textbook called "Give Me Liberty: A History of American Freedom." From a Native American perspective, liberty is not, not what we want, or hasn't been historically helpful for Indigenous communities. It means Christianization. It means forced assimilation. It means urbanization, termination, forced adoption, or kind of adoptive practices. And we're left with kind of individuated Lockean property holding ideals of Native American subjectivity that are at odds with, centuries, if not millennia, of human practice in North America. So I often say, don't give me liberty, because that's not going to be the paradigm that will be helpful for understanding this corner of America, or these corners of America in the 21st century.
Thank you. Irene Teichner brings up the work of another scholar. She writes, I would love for the two scholars to address the influence of Pekka Hamalainen, who's an Icelandic American history scholar at Oxford, on the historians at work on Indigenous topics in this country. And of course, Hamalainen recently wrote a more synthetic book, and his early book is that's the Comanche Empire, I believe. And, if you could just say something about that.
I'm going to leave that one to Ned. Just his response.
Hamalainen is Finnish scholar. And used to teach both in Texas and at UC Santa Barbara before going to Oxford, where he's the Rhodes Professor of American History. And upon that appointment, I actually at the time was very excited that the Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford was teaching Native American history based on his acclaimed first book, The Comanche Empire, which is congruent with some of my earlier works on the Spanish borderlands. I do have a fairly pointed and ultimately disappointed review of that book in the Washington Post from the fall of 2022, where I explore some of my concerns that, like his first book and even his second book called Lakota America, Hamalainen kind of ends his narrative of Indigenous history in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is the kind of paradigm of Turnerian Western American history that we've been trying to move past for a long time. So I tried to emphasize more 20th century and more law and policy and contemporary concerns in my own new book. And would just let readers know that if those are themes or concerns they're interested in, that they would find them more readily explored with my recent title than in his.
Great, thanks. James Atkinson says, excellent presentation today, thank you, and writes, in Autumn of the Black Snake, the creation of the U.S. Army and the invasion that opened the West, William Hoagland asserts that George Washington was, and this is a quote, the biggest land speculator in the colonies. That is, that he enriched himself by using public funds, militias, and ultimately the U.S. Army to prove his specious land claims against indigenous lands in the Ohio Valley and Northwest Territory. If valid, then how much credence do we give to Washington's political assertions of plurality vis-a-vis Jefferson's assertion of democracy? Does the grift tend to negate all other considerations?
That's a great topic for Ned to address. It really shows up across the book. So during that whole section, I was fascinated by that part, Ned.
He's not the largest land speculator. and I can't remember the names of the Virginians who are speculating alongside Boone in Kentucky. And I write a little bit about Boone's prospecting works. But he is one of many. And one of the interesting things that Callaway and others who've written about this phase of Washington's career identify is that the soil exhaustion of the Chesapeake plantations becomes so intensive that they were very well aware that the kind of agricultural durability of their plantation economies was in doubt. And in fact, the 6 or 7 years Washington was away in service for the Continental Army during the Revolution meant that his Mount Vernon would never regain the financial stability it had before his service. So he is trying throughout not just the Revolutionary period, but even the earlier period to gain title to interior lands, which he successfully does as an officer of the British Army, or the Royal Army, after the 7 Years' War. The problem is the British government has limited capacity to actually regulate and come up with property title management practices that frustrates not just him, but other former soldiers and colonists who had fought on behalf of the crown. And again, one of these kind of remarkable things that scholars haven't sufficiently attended to, the year before the Revolution, there is a olive branch petition that accompanies some of the declarations that are heading to the crown that identifies that the 7 years, that the interior had been kind of kept from the colonists in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And so the interior's lands have really been coveted by Virginia gentry leaders, Washington included, for almost a generation before independence in 1783. And they will struggle for another generation to come up with efficient land management practices. But it just reminds us that the interior is a determinative variable in the evolution of the revolutionary struggle and in the kind of constitutional and the history of the early republic in ways that exclusive focuses on individuals or events have yet to really fully identify.
Great, thanks. And we have a question. We have lots of questions, but I think we have time for one more. This is from James Banner. Who writes, and now we're learning through Caroline Pennock's new book on Savage Shores that Native Americans had considerable impacts on European society, and that surely their DNA is now part, as it is in the United States, of the genetic makeup of European and no doubt other populations. What do you make of that? It seems to me that it opens an entirely new frontier for historical inquiry, writes James Banner.
Pennock's book came out, I think, a few months before my April book came out. And I have a copy of it, but have yet to sit down with it. But I've learned enough about it to kind of understand some of the argumentation. It's not the first book to make these claims, I believe, but it is the most kind of expansive in terms of its geographic considerations. A scholar by the name of Nancy Van Dusen at Queen's University in Canada wrote a book called Global Indios about the extent to which the Spanish trafficked indigenous peoples across the Atlantic and up and down the Caribbean and Latin American shorelines well before 1619. For over a century after the Columbian encounter, she estimates nearly 600,000 indigenous peoples were trafficked by the Spanish in various forms of either enslavement or forced servitude. Thousands ending up not only in Spain, but also ending up protesting their enslavement or captivity within Spanish society. And so that's a totally new perspective on American history that really hasn't been sufficiently established. There are scholars, some of whom mentioned in the chat, who've worked on New England and shown the kind of history of dozens of indigenous peoples trafficked before the Mayflower's arrival in 1620. People like Andrew Lippman in the Saltwater Frontier, or Call Thrush in Indigenous London, Margaret Newell's Bonded by Brethren or Brethren by Bondage, all of which have kind of explored, Lisa Brooks to also a certain extent, more of the post-1620 period. But there's a history of indigenous enslavement in basically all the realms of European imperial rule, Latin America, British North America, French North America, and that these captives became incorporated into Caribbean societies, into Iberian, to a lesser extent into English societies, but North African and other worlds of particularly kind of slave trafficking centers. We shouldn't kind of, that's what the binary history, again, limits our kind of capacity to see our continent and hemisphere's history in its fullest dimensions, because of this kind of synonymy between African American and slavery and enslavement more broadly. So there's much to learn. I'm really glad we had this opportunity to talk at some length this afternoon, and look forward to potentially future engagements together.
And Ned, can I just jump in on that, and you can say a little bit about this, but one of the things that I haven't been able to mention that I think is a really interesting part, especially at the end of the book, is the last 100 years you really frame through these women, Native women, who are leaders, who are really important leaders, with Laura Cornelius Kellogg and Zikala Shah, Gertrude Bonin, and then ending with Ada Deer. And I think it's a really great way to say you don't have to leave the continent to undercut a lot of this history. If you actually take seriously the not just the voices, and not just the agency, but the power of these Native women to actually make a difference and to make things different in all three of these cases. And I thought that was a really wonderful way of telling the story in a different yet obvious way, right? And I wanted to point that that's another sort of energy that I think comes out of the narrative that I really appreciated. Want to make sure I mention that.
Thank you. And one could very easily, maybe not isn't the right word, but one could very effectively conceive of a similar volume like this, a synthetic history of the United States from a Native American women's historical perspective. And I believe Melinda Maynard Lowry and Christina Snyder are working on a native history of the Native South, and I'm sure we'll have a certain kind of heavy emphasis in that direction. I did heavily draw upon Christina Ackley and Christina Stanchu's edited works of Cornelius Kellogg, which are relatively recently compiled. That's the rediscovery we're talking about, is that people have gone out. You've set help bring much energy to these areas yourself, but people have gone and done the labor. It is time, as you were saying, for us to reevaluate, not necessarily totally new terrains, but familiar ones with new insights.
I want to say thank you to both Ned Blackhawk and Robert Warrior for this conversation. I think the title of the book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of America, of U.S. History, really says so much, both rediscovery and unmaking, and you've explored why that's so. And I appreciate that you've had this conversation today and engaged our audience with it. I also want to thank everybody who's been watching today on Zoom. We didn't get to all the questions we had, but we're going to send the questions to Professor Warrior and Professor Blackhawk so that they know what was asked and who asked it. I want to thank all of you who've been watching. If you want to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are all available on the AAS YouTube channel. This one will be in the coming days as well. Our next virtual public program takes place next Wednesday afternoon at 4 p.m. when Lauren Hughes, our Vice President for Collections, and Andrew W. Mellon, Curator of Graphic Arts here at AAS, presents Surprises from the Stacks, Hello 2024. Lauren will be showing and discussing New Year's Day materials from the AAS collections, including broadsides from the 1700s, party invitations from the early 19th century, and chromolithographed greeting cards from the post-Civil War era. This program, which is co-hosted with the Grolier Club, promises an inside look at ephemera here at AAS and how they were made. Again, thanks so much, Ned and Robert, for being with us. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Check out the AAS website for future programs. And for now, have a good evening.
Thank you,
Scott.